Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's top of the hour, and we're going to get started. We have an hour for this session. We want to pack a lot of stuff into this short amount of time that we're going to have together. But I am absolutely thrilled to welcome General Nakasone back to Brown University. He was here a year ago in uniform, and now we have him just fresh off retirement. His last official day was this past Monday, April 1st, and we have him fresh off retirement, and so we are just thrilled to have him here today, along with his wife Susan, who's joined us. Susan, thank you for being here so much. Welcome. You know, when I was last year, of course, when General Nakasone was here, he was again in uniform and immense responsibilities on his shoulders, and of course, you know, he's got a lot of bosses too, the Secretary of Defense, the President of the United States, and so you know, I'm sure there's always considerations when answering questions and all these things, that you're not only representing yourself, but the military and Cyber Command and all the other people above you that you need the answer to. So I was tempted to say, you know, advertise this as Paul Nakasone,
Unplugged.
Untethered, unplugged. Yeah, so we'll see how this goes now. But welcome. Let me just read a brief bio, and then we're going to get into some great questions, I hope. General Paul M. Nakasone, U.S. Army, retired, is from an Army family whose 3 generations of service dates back to World War II. Paul spent nearly 4 decades in the United States Army serving with the U.S., the Republic of Korea, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Paul's military career mirrors the national security landscape of the nation. He began his service at the close of the Cold War, was present at the Pentagon on 9/11, deployed to combat in Iraq and Afghanistan, designed and led cyber forces, and served during both the Trump and Biden administrations. He concluded his career as Commander, U.S. Cyber Command, and Director of the National Security Agency. This final assignment, spanning nearly 6 years, and by the way, that's unusual. Usually these type of commands, these posts are for about 3 years, just goes to the exceptional leadership and confidence that General Nakasone had among the top national security infrastructure, including the President of the United States. Which allowed Paul to lead the largest element of the U.S. intelligence community and Defense Department's cyber forces during 3 national elections, a global pandemic, and increased threats to our homeland. Throughout his career, Paul brought innovative and transformative leadership to solve complex challenges. Paul and his wife Susan are the proud parents of 4 children, twins too, as I recall, and who form the nucleus of Team Nakasone. He is passionate about encouraging national service and the development of caring, competent, and confident leaders. General Nakasone, welcome, my friend. I'm glad to have you here. Thank you for making the trip back to Rhode Island once again. We had a great discussion last year, and I'm looking for our discussion today.
Thanks. It's great to see you again, Professor Langevin, and to everyone here at Brown University, welcome back from spring break. I remember last year, I think it was about the same time, and you all looked tanned, relaxed, and ready for the final couple weeks of school. But it's good to see everyone again. And again, thanks to the Watson Institute as well.
Absolutely. Thank you. So, thank you for your extraordinary service to the nation. Let me start off with saying that for almost 4 decades now, and really incredible, and I wish you all the best in your next chapter. And we're thrilled to have you here today. And I thought if we could just start with kind of an overview of the organization that you led, the Men and Women of U.S. Cyber Command and NSA, and help the audience here who may not be familiar with the important role that U.S. Cyber Command plays, along with NSA, and the work that the men and women there do to protect the nation in cyberspace.
So great question, great way to set foundation. U.S. Cyber Command, it is one of 11 combatant commands, and the United States organizes its warfighting functions into combatant commands. You've probably heard of U.S. Central Command, U.S. Indo-PACOM, U.S. Space Command. Well, U.S. Cyber Command is really the new kid on the block. It's about 14 years old. and you have the responsibility for defending the Department of Defense's networks, data, and weapon systems. You also have the responsibility to provide cyber effects, that's offensive effects, in support of operations that the president approves. So total about 35,000 folks that are amongst all the services in U.S. Cyber Command, and we're headquartered at Fort Meade. You work for the Secretary of Defense and you work for the President. So the chain of command is very, very clear. There's no doubt that you get orders from the Secretary or you get orders from the President. The National Security Agency, it really is, if you break it down, the place where our nation makes code and breaks code. So how important is that? Well, let's just consider our most sensitive communications, our most lethal weapon systems. They are all empowered with encryption that's made by the National Security Agency. So that's the idea of making code. Critical for being able to ensure that we have assurance of our communications and assurance of our weapon systems. The other thing is breaking code, and we can get into this as well, but think of the capability of an agency that can break into not unclassified networks, but our adversaries' most sensitive information. The most sensitive information that our adversaries have to provide early warning, indications, and policy and military support to leaders in the United States. So you'd say, well, Paul, what's an example of that? Well, let's go back to the fall of 2021. President makes a very foundational decision to release some of our most sensitive information to the world. Okay, now think about that. You're having the director of the National Security Agency, you're having this discussion with your people. Hey, we want to take what's our most sensitive information and we're going to release it to the world. Okay, so that's a little bit of culture change. I recall that day and it was about as quiet as this room is right now. But it is essential that we have that indications and warning to understand what our adversaries are doing. The national security operates outside the United States. The national security has incredible oversight by all three branches of government. They are not spying on Americans. That is not what they do. And so it's just a very, very interesting agency in terms of providing the nation a competitive advantage. About 65,000 people, 60% civilian, 40% military. You work for the Director of National Intelligence and the Secretary of Defense. So you'd say, well, why do you have like two jobs? Seems like, there should be two people, two jobs, right? Well, the big thing is that we operate in the same domain, and that's the domain of cyberspace. And so if you're going to operate in cyberspace, you need authorities, you need intelligence, and you need expertise. And that's why we bring the two together.
Excellent. Hey, great overview. I should have mentioned that the way General Nakasone and I met was during my time in Congress. And for those of you I haven't had the privilege of meeting, I served in Congress representing Rhode Island 2nd District for 22 years. And most of my time in Congress was focused a great deal on national security issues, having served on both the Armed Services Committee, the House Intelligence Committee, and the Homeland Security Committee. And I chaired the subcommittee that oversaw U.S. Cyber Command and the NSA. It was a real privilege doing that work. And of course, during that time, I came to deeply appreciate what you talked about, early warning, that good intelligence is always going to be the very pointy tip of the spear. And the better intelligence that we have, we know where to target our resources, target our enemies and adversaries to better protect the country. So it's extraordinary, the important work that you and your team have done.
If I might, and I'd like to give context to that because Professor Langevin is incredibly, humble and understate what his role was. Basically, his leadership allows us as a nation to move forward in cyberspace. When I think you originally came into Congress in the National Defense Authorization Act, that's, how the nation spends $800 billion of its tax money. There was really no reference to cyber. And by the time he leaves in 2022, it's replete with all the things that we have to do to be able to secure, the domain where we really store our nation's wealth. Think how important cyberspace is to our nation. And that's, what really good, Congress oversight does. It's like your board of directors, right? You'd say, hey, you're a 4-star general. You can do anything you want. No. Right? You have oversight from Congress, oversight from the judicial branch. You have, the Secretary of Defense, and you even have your own wife. So, it's a big thing.
Very big thing.
Sorry.
Well put. Thank you for that. So can you talk about the cyber threat landscape?
Yeah.
I've often, when I've asked about it or when I talk about it, there are obviously the major nations that challenge us the most are China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. But it goes beyond that because of cyber threat actors. And talk about those the nations that challenge us the most, and then if you could, how we're organized to protect against that. The cyber mission force in particular is what I'm thinking about.
Let's start with the threat and think about the threat in cyberspace really along 3 lines. First of all, nation states. Big nation states, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. Okay? China, the most replete in terms of quantity, in terms of their ability to steal our intellectual property, in terms of just the size of what they do. Russia, the best in terms of doing information operations. And we can come back to that in a bit, but having watched the Russians well over a decade, you can recall what 2016 was like in terms of our national elections. Okay, you can see their information operations working in different parts of the globe today as they try to describe or try to, spin a narrative about what's happening in Ukraine. Iran, a nation that has conducted destructive attacks against the United States in cyberspace. Whether or not it's against our Federal Reserve banking system in New York, whether or not it's against the Sands Casino in Las Vegas, this is a nation that has a growing capability and is not afraid to use it, both capability and intent. And then North Korea. North Korea is funding a sizable portion of their GNP through stealing cryptocurrency in cyberspace. So it's a new day in terms of being able to, add to the coffers of your GNP, but this is how they do it. They have become very, very good at ransomware. So that's the nation states. Let's talk about non-nation states. Non-nation states, those are actors like ISIS. Those are terrorist organizations that use cyberspace primarily to be able to spread their message, garner followers, or raise money. Those are the 3 major efforts that are done by nation-state actors. Other nation-state actors are ransomware actors. Okay, spring of 2021, Colonial Pipeline. Was anyone surprised that 43% of the nation's petroleum products ran through Colonial Pipeline? I certainly was after, there's a ransomware attack there. And so this is where non-nation state actors are becoming much more prevalent in terms of what's going on in the domain of cyberspace. And the last piece is technology. So technology, whether or not you consider, machine learning or artificial intelligence or any of the different technologies that we're using today, this has been, the great challenge and opportunity for our nation. We are a technical nation. We are an IT nation. Being able to stay an IT nation requires us to be able to protect that intellectual property. So that's how I would describe the threat landscape. Let's talk about the home field. How does it work here in the United States to defend in cyberspace? Well, first of all, you'd think, well, U.S. Cyber Command, that's all they do is they defend the nation. Well, yes, but our responsibilities are for the Department of Defense. They're also for outside the United States, right? We do not use military forces within the United States with the exception of the National Guard. Okay, so we're outside the United States. Primarily in the United States, that falls to 2 organizations, the Department of Homeland Security, which is CISA, and also the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So those 2 organizations make up a big portion of what the government does in securing cyberspace, whether or not that's with the 16 critical infrastructure sectors in the United States, or whether or not that's being able to prevent ransomware. Those are the organizations that our government has determined does a lot of the work. And then the private sector. So any discussion about how we are organized must include the private sector. Let me give you an example. Microsoft has 400 million endpoints in the world. Endpoint, like a computer, a server, some type of piece of software that Microsoft is running somewhere in the world. 400 million endpoints, a lot of them within the United States. So being able to work with the private sector, providing information about what our threat actors are doing, provides us greater capability as a nation. But you have to stitch all of that together. And the work of that is done by the National Cyber Director. a position that was instituted by the Cyberspace Solarium Commission that Professor Langevin was co-lead on. And so this is the mosaic that is the United States in cyberspace.
Perfect. And as far as U.S. Cyber Command, can you talk about how we're organized there, the Cyber Mission Force, and the three major components that make up
Yep.
the Cyber Mission Force?
That's great. U.S. Cyber Command. I come back to this idea of a combatant command. So roughly about 35,000 people. Each of the services has a cyber component. Army cyber, Navy cyber, Air Force cyber, Marine Corps cyber. Okay, when you take a look at the organization, we have an elite force that's called the Cyber National Mission Force. We call it CNMF. A lot of times you'll hear stories about hunt forward operations. In fact, one of the things that I talked a lot about was sending teams from the Cyber National Mission Force to different countries at their request to hunt on their networks. Why was that important? Well, we figured out that if you can hunt on a network like we did in 2018 in Ukraine, we could find out what our adversaries are doing. This is our most elite force. About 2,000 folks. They're headquartered at Fort Meade, all services. They are the equivalent of the Joint Special Operations Force in cyber. Then we actually have an organization, the Joint Force Headquarters for the DoD Information Network. Yeah, it's a mouthful there. They are responsible for defending our networks, our data, and our weapons system. We call them JFHQ DODN. They are completely looking at defense. And then each of the services has a component, as I said, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, that looks at different parts of the world. And so that's how we've organized ourselves at U.S. Cyber Command. But again, the big pieces in terms of when you think about U.S. Cyber Command, think about three things. First of all, they operate outside the United States. The second piece is they have a full spectrum mission, so it's both offense and defense. And the third piece is the only way that they have power is working with other elements, either of the government or the private sector. Those are the three big pieces about U.S. Cyber Command.
Thank you. So in terms of numbers and just how daunting this challenge is, going up against an adversary like China, for example. One of your predecessors, General Alexander, called the intellectual property theft that's occurred over the years, much of it by way of China, is the greatest transfer of wealth in human history, something on the order of hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars of intellectual property. Can you talk about, more specifically, the People's Republic of China and the amount of resources that they're putting into this? And others have said, everybody, spies on each other and such. And that is, look, espionage has gone on from the beginning of time, right? But there's a difference between looking at gaining information and insights into what your enemies and adversaries are doing. There's a whole other thing to actually be stealing the intellectual property. And so in terms of the numbers that we're talking about, how daunting the challenge is.
Chris Wray, who's the director of FBI, has been on record saying that if you took all of the resources of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, it's probably in the the numbers of 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 folks in the FBI that does cyber, you'd be outnumbered 50-1 by the Chinese. So if we're going to look at it quantitatively, we're always going to lose. I never look at it quantitatively because we're never going to have as many folks as the Chinese. A mass is always to our disadvantage. The way I look at it is the competitive advantage of quality. Okay, what is the competitive advantage of quality? It's the private sector. It's innovation. It's intelligence. It's the ability to have partners. The fact that the United States has a global network of partners across the world in different time zones, in different elements of the world is our competitive advantage. Who does China partner with? Oh yeah, North Korea, Pakistan. Okay, well, I will take Australia and Germany and Japan and Korea and NATO and all of the other countries that partner with us any day over North Korea and Pakistan. Here's the other thing is that when you take a look at the innovation of the United States, it still is the most innovative country in the world. Take a look at what our private sector does. Take a look at what we're developing in a series of different startups all the time. So this is really the ability for us to work with the private sector. How hard can that be? Let me relate to you a story. I had just taken over the National Security Agency in May of 2018. And I don't remember the visitor, but the visitor came to my office and they looked out the window and they said, "Hey, Paul, you see that fence line that runs all around your agency and command? We've got a pretty high fence, triple stand, barbed wire, the whole bit." He said, "Your greatest challenge is getting ideas outside the barbed wire into your command and your agency." It's true. It's true. We as a government, we as an agency and as a command, we don't necessarily always look for a series of partners. And in today's world, particularly in cyberspace, this is where you get tremendous advantage. And so I think any commander of Cyber Command, any director of the National Security Agency is going to spend a lot of time with the innovators of the United States because this is where the advantage is.
Absolutely. And I want to talk about private sector in just a minute too, but I also want to go back to the Cyber Mission Force, and you referenced hunt forward operations and how important they are. If we go into maybe some detail on that, I know in particular when you mentioned Ukraine and how important that was both leading up to the Russian invasion in Ukraine and then during the war subsequent, and how that work helps to protect us here at home.
Yeah, a great series of stories. I mean, let me begin in the fall of 2018. We're getting ready for the midterm elections. I was convinced coming out of my nomination hearing that there was going to be a safe and secure election in November of 2018, or there was going to be a new director of NSA and new commander of U.S. Cyber Command. So that really had a great motivation on me. And so as we put together a group of folks to look at how we're going to secure our elections differently, one of the things that came to me is some young folks probably, in their late 20s said, hey, sir, why don't we send a team to a foreign country at their request and see if we can hunt on their networks to find out what the Russians are doing, because normally they're going to test things outside of Russia. And then, this is the big piece that we normally don't talk about. How about if we take that information and instead of taking it back to Fort Meade, we share it with the private sector? Because what had occurred in cyberspace is a series of different cyber industries that were looking at threat. And so if you're going to, share that information with the private sector, one of the things we found out is that immediately they would identify it. Oh, it's the first time we've seen this malware. So I equated that to those of you that enjoy Mark Twain. This is Tom Sawyer painting the fence, right? You get someone to paint your fence. And this is the private sector. But more importantly, what you get is you get an ability to do your mission much more effectively. What was interesting about that is the fact that as we started to send hunt forward teams out into different countries, everyone wants it, right? Everyone wants to see it because it's completely transparent. This is what we're seeing. We'll work with you. We'll share this information with you. Who would not want that? And then to Professor Langevin's point, we showed up in 2018 in Ukraine. The fourth time we had done a hunt forward in Ukraine was December of 2021. And, myself as the commander gave, I thought, some really good guidance. Hey, go over there, help them out, and then come back for Christmas and we'll figure out what we're going to be doing. Well, they got there in the 5th of December, 2021, and I got a call from the leader of that hunt forward team. And she said to me, "Hey, sir, we're not coming home. This is really serious. And what we're seeing and what we're able to do with the Ukrainians is incredibly impactful." And so they stayed well up into the middle of February, right before the invasion. And for a period of 60 days plus, we're able to assist the Ukrainians to develop a hardened networks and data systems that were able to withstand the attacks of the Russians. And so that's kind of the realization that, presence in a country really matters. And, there's also a communication from a partner. Oh, it's serious enough for the United States to send their people to our country? This is one of the intangible things that I think we've learned from Hunt Forward.
Absolutely. You can just I picture it as, you've got a lot of bad actors in your house or what have you in sensitive areas, and it's in the dark of night and you turn the lights on and Cyber Command is there and catching the bad actors and see what kind of tools they're using, what their operations are. And thankfully we use that information to keep us safe back home as well.
And the really neat thing is you have Cybercom doing that at the same time the National Security Agency is understanding, what the actors are doing. So it's almost like a cycle that's feeding off each other, and that's really important.
We talk about, different elements of the government working together collectively. We can look at back to 2016 and then preparing for the 2020 elections. One would say that we probably got caught off guard, and we weren't actually as prepared as we didn't see it coming in a sense of the interference, the level of interference that Russia was willing to undertake and get involved with in terms of potentially interfering with our elections. And then subsequent to that, we were much better prepared in the 2020 elections. And can you talk about the Russia small group that you put together?
Yeah. So soon after I took over, and I share with you, my concern that maybe there was going to be a new commander, new director if things didn't go well. I asked NSA, I said, okay, tell me everything that you did for the 2016 elections. And so we had a series of leaders, and they said, we did all this, and we did that, we did, and it's like, oh, okay, I got it. You were doing a lot of reporting, good. After the fact, excellent. And then I asked Cyber Command, I said, hey, would you please tell me what you did in preparation to defend our elections in 2016? And they showed me all these PowerPoint slides. There is never a command in the Department of Defense that doesn't have PowerPoint slides. And they're building off each other. I was like, okay, so you were doing a lot of planning, not a lot of doing. And so I asked the question, I brought the leaders of the two organizations together, and I said, hey, so you were doing reporting, you were doing planning, who was doing the doing? All right, it's like this, right? It's quiet. No one's doing the doing. I said, well, that's got to stop. And so we use that as, and with, a lot of help from Secretary Mattis, who has his own momentum, I found out, we were able to get the authorities, we were able to get, the attention that we needed to focus on to beat the Russians at their game. And that really focused on three different areas. First of all, we said, hey, we're going to understand the threat. That's the first area. NSA, you're responsible for that. Second thing is, we're going to take all that threat and we're going to share it. We're not going to keep it, we're going to share it. We're going to share it with the FBI, we're going to share it with DHS and CISA, we're going to share it with the state and local areas, everything that we're seeing outside the United States that might be a threat to us. And the third thing, we're going to act. Okay, when someone says that, they're going to interfere with our elections, we're going to take action against them. And that was the role of Cyber Command. And I think to your really excellent point, and this is, I appreciate your very kind words about staying 6 years. Well, I figured that after 3 years, I still hadn't got the job done. So maybe 3 more years, you'll figure this out. What I figured out was that the way that you have impact in the U.S. government is through authorities. And no agency, command, element of our government has all the authorities. And so what you need to do is figure out how do you bring everyone together to utilize their authorities in a manner that's synchronized and impactful. Okay, so that means like working with Department of Justice or working with Commerce or working with state. It's amazing how much power state has in terms of being able to, to obviously call out bad actions. And being able to do that is the essence of getting to a very successful outcome. 2018, we had a very, very small group. We called it the Russia Small Group. By 2020, we renamed ourselves. We called ourselves the Election Security Group. And by 2022, and now in 2024, what you'll see is a much bigger group that includes not only elements of our government, but also elements of the private sector and academia. You want to bring all those together because, to your point, no one has the authorities to do it all. And that's the way that, that's the DNA of the United States, right? That's why we broke away from Great Britain, 1776. We didn't like that. And so this is how you do business in cyberspace today.
So you touched on the private sector, and there's other things I wanted to get to, but I do want to get to this question of, and it's one of the things that's challenged me during my policymaking years, and still that I struggle with, because we have U.S. Cyber Command and NSA that are protecting the .mil network, the DODIN. You've got CISA that is protecting the .gov network. But then we have the .com world, and there's no general or director that's in charge of protecting the .com world, especially in areas private sector, critical infrastructure, where the most damage can be done. How are we doing there, and what could we and should we be doing better to help protect the .com?
Well, I think you've accurately stated, the challenge that we have, right? I mean, there isn't one single person in charge, and I don't think there'll ever be one single person in charge of the .com. Here's how we think about it. We think about it in, U.S. Cyber Command and NSA as a competitive advantage. What are the competitive advantages we provide to the .com? One of the things is that intelligence, right? And so the big piece of what you have to be able to do with the private sector is operate where they operate. They don't operate on classified networks. They operate on the internet. And so we said, hey, if we're going to do that, why don't we set up an organization within NSA and Cyber Command that doesn't operate behind the fence line, that you can actually drive up to, you can bring your phone into. I mean, that's one of the fascinating things to me is like everyone's got phones at work. We don't have that at Cybercom and NSA. But that's really important when you're dealing with the private sector. And so the other thing we thought about is, hey, why don't we provide a series of services? What if we provided to, not necessarily the Northrop Grumman's, Boeing's, or, the big organizations that run our critical infrastructure. Why don't we provide it to the second tier folks that are doing work that don't necessarily have scanning or don't have secure email? Why don't we provide that as a service? They have to sign up for it, they can work it, and I think that's the key piece. Again, provide something that can be of value to them. This is hard work, and this is a new mindset in terms of how you do it. And so I think if you're going to say, how do you grade yourself? So I think I grade ourselves on, a low B that has to be moving towards an A. Because, as we'll probably talk about here in a second, the Chinese do not have this problem, right? And so they can find the vulnerabilities and they can exploit those vulnerabilities.
Well said. See, where could I go with this now? Because I have so many questions that I wanted. Let me ask this in terms of how Cyber Command operates when you're doing hunt forward operations. There was a time where it was unclear what laws or rules govern actions in cyberspace. And then Congress changed that, and we made clear that these are, cyber actions are under traditional military authorities. But
right.
You can talk more about that.
So I've lived in cyberspace for well over a decade. And one of the things that I realized is that for the most part, we're pretty obtuse, right? And we don't normally talk a lot about it, and it's difficult to explain. And, you're talking to the Secretary of Defense about a, denial of service attack. Think about that, having that discussion, right? And I'm trying to think about how you explain this. And we don't necessarily talk in terms that are relatively well understood. And so one of the things that we did understand is that there wasn't a lot of authorities that would allow U.S. Cyber Command to operate. And so one of the important things is that we were able to work with Congress to say, hey, what you do in terms of operating on a foreign partner's network or operating outside the United States, we expect you to do that. We expect you to obviously have civilian control of our military. We expect that these plans are going to be reviewed by the Secretary of Defense and other key individuals, and you're going to testify about it. But that ability to kind of lift the curtain and say, this is what's going on. And I think that's key for us going forward. So I had ABC News come into our headquarters into what we call the Battle Bridge. It was like amazing. It was Pierre Thomas. He was like looking. It's like, wow. And you'd look down at the floor, and he says, "Is this where you actually operate?" And I said, "Yeah, we operate right here, and we do a series of operations." And where's the buttons? I said, "There's no buttons here." And so I mean, if you pull it up on the internet, it's fascinating because you can see that he's just kind of amazed. What I took from that though is that if he's amazed, I'm sure most Americans would be amazed, and they can't be amazed. I mean, there has to be a comfort that we're going to operate there, and they have confidence in the way that we operate, much in the same way our Special Operations Forces or our Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines operate every day. It just can't be like that, and I think that's been part of the challenge, right? We have perhaps been less than, I think, transparent in what we do, and that is really important.
Agreed. People have to have confidence in
Yep.
the work, and there's the right authorities and checks and balances in place. let me kind of shift gears for a minute, then we'll do some audience questions in just a minute, so I hope you kind of think of some good ones. Something that's on the minds of everybody today is AI, and how that is going to change the world, and how is AI going to be used as a tool to make us more secure in cyberspace? But then what do we have to be worried about in terms of the bad actors of how they use that technology against us to make cybersecurity even more difficult and challenging?
Let me take this in three vectors, because I've watched just the development of artificial intelligence, machine learning, generative AI with great interest. Right? I had first seen machine learning way back in the in the early 2000s as we were starting to use it for targeting. But here's three different areas you should think about. First of all is artificial intelligence. I think it's the most transformative technology in our lifetimes. And I offer to all of you Gen Zers out there, what's the most transformative technology that you've seen? Probably the smartphone, right? I mean, I would just guess, for my parents, it's probably the car or whatever it was. I mean, but this is going to be just unique in terms of what it's going to be able to do for our nation and for our economy and the way that we're going to operate in the future. And so the first thing that I have concerns about is we are the leader in artificial intelligence. In terms of, if you take a look at what platforms are being used today, they're all U.S. platforms by our adversaries, which tells me that we still have the technology of choice. One of the most important things is we have to protect that. So that's the intellectual seed corn, I think, for our future economy. Now think about what apps and smartphones have done for our economy. Oh my goodness. For someone that remembers, operating off of printed maps, like MapQuest and that kind of stuff, and you take a look at what is on your phone today with Waze, or you take a look at, anything like Uber or, DoorDash, and this has been just like a windfall for our nation. That's the type of windfall I think AI is going to be for us in the future. And so we have to make sure that we protect the intellectual property of what our companies are developing. Second piece is, I'm excited about artificial intelligence in the sense of being able to secure our networks and our data. Our networks are incredibly hard to secure today. So there are so many vulnerabilities. We talk in terms of attack surface. There are so many different parts of a network that need to get patched or need to get updated rapidly that human-wise, you just can't do it. And so being able to actually have a machine that does it, and we have a self-healing network when we see something like that, that's fantastic. And the third piece is, my greatest concern right now, I think, with artificial intelligence is getting ready for an election and thinking about, what deep fakes might look like in terms of being able to utilize technology that would make a candidate say something different than necessarily they would ever say. Make it appear that there's a story that candidate X or Y is doing something, or a story that's occurring that is not necessarily true, but is being believed by a large swath of our population. That's concerning to me. And so being able to make sure that we have that are really kind of the three different elements as I think about AI.
It's on everybody's mind these days, and it's going to be great opportunities, but also great challenges.
Right.
And the challenge for all of us is to try to figure out how we maximize the upside, but limit the downside to the greatest degree possible. Last thing I'm going to ask, and then we'll go to audience questions, because I know this is a passion for you, that we can have all the right structure and policies in place, but without the people, we're nowhere. And talk about the cyber workforce and also the importance of working with the private sector and developing talent across the board. And how do we maximize and you tap into that talent? I know under your leadership, we created Dreamport. That was private sector engagement. But anything, however you wanted, wherever you would like to take this.
So, I think I've seen the power of our technology as a nation. I've seen the power of our tradecraft. But truly the game-changing element of all of this is our talent. So how do we build a broader set of, people that can do this type of work? I think it has to begin much earlier in terms of being able to encourage young people to think about science, technology, engineering, mathematics, girls that code. I mean, all the different populations of our nation that necessarily haven't been touched by what I think is, the most important, field that our nation's going to be able to work for in the future. And so I think, just to get at your first point, is we have to increase just the pool of people that have this ability and this knowledge. The second thing is I do think there has to be, greater opportunities for us to take a look at scholarship for service and different ways to fund young people and people that want to come back to our workforce to change careers, to be able to do that pretty rapidly. It's interesting that, I'm the son of a community college teacher. And, I've looked at the community college structure and I've looked at my own workforce. That 2-year degree can be tremendously helpful in terms of being able to steer a large portion of a population that hasn't necessarily been in IT, that can be in IT in the future. Not everyone needs a 4-year degree to be successful in what's going on. Then I think the last piece is, the way that I see it, is that for us, and I'll speak as a former government official, now a private citizen, I am tremendously hopeful that our government can do a much better job of not only recruiting, training, and retaining, but also returning people from the private sector necessarily into government. So we look at the model, particularly in the Department of Defense and our intelligence community, is, hey, you're going to stay for 37 years. Not everyone wants to stay for 37 years. As you mentioned, we have 4 children. I'm not sure they want to stay for 37 years, right? But I think that being able to come and go, particularly, what I've noticed is that people like to go out to the private sector and work. Why can't they come back and then work within government for a period of time? And they go back. That's just not a model that necessarily fits the DNA of how the United States operates today. And I think we have to operate differently.
Agreed. There's so much talent out there.
Yep.
We want to be able to harness it and tap into it. All right, let me pause there and let's open it up to some audience questions. Yes, sir.
Thank you, General. Thank you, Congressman. General, you mentioned that with regard to the 2020 election and election integrity, that if certain threats were proven, then Cyber Command would be responsible for reacting. That suggests a question which you may or may not want to answer, or at least answer fully, which is this realm similar to conventional warfare in the sense that there are red lines that exist and are understood by the parties and counterparties, which is to say there's an element of mutually assured destruction that exists in the business model if those red lines are crossed?
I'd be more than happy to answer that. So as I look at cyberspace, it's not the same equation as we thought about nuclear weapons, right? Why is that? Because for the most part, for almost all part, nuclear weapons are the monopoly of a government, right? It's very high barriers to get in there. They're controlled, they're well centralized. They're only utilized after some significant action has happened. Cyberspace, the vast majority of operations are done not by a government, but by private citizens in the private sector. There are low barriers to entry. Everyone can do this. And so one of the things that I wrote about, and one of the areas that we focused on, was this idea of persistent engagement. I watched for a period of almost 8 years. This is how it went. Someone would intrude on our networks. They'd steal our data. We'd find it. And then we'd try to, what I would call clean up on aisle 9. They'd already taken our stuff. And we'd say, that's terrible. Let's fix our network so it doesn't happen again. Then it would happen again. And I'd be like, this is a losing strategy. So I said, hey, we want a new strategy. And this new strategy is going to be called persistent engagement. It dovetailed with the Department of Defense Defend Forward. What the Department of Defense said in their strategy is said, hey, we're going to operate outside the United States. We are going to look at our adversaries and we're going to take action if and when we see or sense that they are going to conduct operations against the United States. And so at U.S. Cyber Command, we developed the idea of persistent engagement. We're going to enable and act. Enable, We talked about enabling. This is hunt forward. This is being able to share intelligence. This is being able to continually look at your adversaries and not wait for them to come and steal your stuff. Prevent them from doing that. Or you're going to act. Hey, there are a number of ways we can act. You know, cyber actors need infrastructure. Cyber actors need money. Cyber actors need a number of different things. Let's act against them. And so to your point, when we looked at the 2018 elections, one of the things we said is, hey, we're not going to wait until the 8th of November after the elections to say, oh my gosh, they've interfered in our elections again. That's terrible. No, we're going to have a campaign, and we're going to make sure that when the 7th of November comes, 2018, it's safe and secure. And that's what we did. And that's really kind of the template for how we operate today. A campaign. Go after our adversaries outside the United States. Make sure it's really difficult for them to operate, but don't wait for them to do it to you.
I like the term we've used in the past, creating operational friction. That you're not just letting your adversaries act with impunity, but you're confronting them at each step of the way and causing them some difficulty as well and expense.
And I think that that's an important piece. Coming back to this idea of the National Defense Authorization Act, when we talk about the fact that we have to operate in cyberspace, that it's a responsibility of the Department of Defense to secure their networks, that's important. But you saw, yesterday, the president talked to President Xi of China for over 100 minutes. And one of the topics, cyber. So that's an important piece, right? Our leaders are talking about that. So our adversaries should understand that this is on our minds. And we won't, we won't continue to, look at ourselves and say, oh my gosh, we've had another intrusion. Great question.
Hi, thank you for coming. I was wondering, it seems like you believe in the immense promise of artificial intelligence, as many of us do. But there's also been some of the top scientists in the United States, including the CEOs of some of the most important companies in AI, have warned about the potentially catastrophic consequences of developing these high-level machine intelligences. And even in their public documents, they outline ways in which these could come about, both superhuman persuasion through deepfakes and things like that, but also through model autonomy, unexpected exfiltration, and widening the access to chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear weapons, etc. And so I was wondering if the NSA or Cyber Command is working in this space to ensure that these models keep sort of America in the lead and bring innovation, but at the same time preventing sort of the tail end of extreme risks that they might pose.
Yeah, great question. First name again?
How?
Tao. Okay, so Tao, here's what I would say. The first thing is you have to understand how the models work. Really important, and that's really the genesis of what U.S. Cyber Command, or the National Security Agency does, understanding how the technology functions. The second piece is then being able to understand, how it's being used. Okay, how it's going to be used is going to be, then a discussion of what the policymakers do at the Department of Defense or the National Security Council in terms of what we're going to do about that. And so those are critical pieces of what goes on. But I think the whole piece of it begins with this idea of understanding how the technology operates and how it might be able to be operated and how it's going to be used in the future. That's one of the areas that we still continue to work towards. I am very, very heartened by the fact that a number of different U.S. companies, along with foreign companies, have come back to say that these are the things that we will prevent our AI models from doing. I think that's a really good first step. But I think it's not the last step that they're going to do either.
General and Congressman, thank you for coming. I was just curious about your take on quantum computers and how they might impact cybersecurity, and particularly how China has been developing in their quantum capabilities, and whether this should be something on our minds, whether we're doing enough to think about this.
Yeah, great question. So the idea of quantum computing, this type of computing that can, if successfully fielded, break almost all known encryption today, all commercial encryption. So, that would provide any nation a tremendous advantage. The first piece that's important is the fact that the president has signed a document saying within 10 years we're going to have quantum-resistant encryption. Again, this is the making codes piece that I talked about earlier. This is what the National Security Agency does with the National Institute of Science and Technology, NIST. So I think that that is something we have to be able to do. And I think the other piece of it is, to your point, is China has put a number of different statements out about being the quantum leader in the future. I'm not sure that I believe that necessarily where they're at today, but I think that we should be very, very, cautious in terms of the fact that they're not going to stop in terms of just looking at it, that they will invest in it. And I think that our nation will have to as well.
Having raw data in large quantities is going to be a critical part of developing the technologies. So how can we compete with the Chinese and their vast amounts of data while upholding our values of freedom and privacy when it comes to AI?
Well, I think data is only one piece of being able to utilize generative artificial intelligence. It's also the fact that you need infrastructure. It's also the fact that you need compute power. It's also the fact that you need talent. All of those areas are areas that the United States continues to excel in. We should continue to excel in there. If you're a stockholder of NVIDIA, congratulations. You've done pretty well over the past couple years. Because these GPUs that they make, no one makes them better. So again, this comes back to what our competitive advantage is. And I look at that and I say, okay, let's make sure that we maintain that advantage.
Hi, my name is Kendra Zama. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. I just had a question on how can government agencies implement a layered cyber deterrence strategy across private and public sectors to minimize exploits in both consumer data and edge devices that are very much exploited?
It's pretty simple, right? I mean, a strategy that begins with, hey, understand what our adversaries are doing. So it begins with a really robust intelligence piece of what's going on. The second thing is, okay, from that information, what are the vulnerabilities that we have on our own networks today? That's the challenge, okay? Tremendous vulnerabilities in terms of what's going on, to include the power, space, and cooling, I guess. Kendra, was that you? Okay. And then I think the third piece is, and this again comes back to this idea of making code, encryption. Okay, encryption is a really critical piece of what goes on and being able to secure our end-to-end communications. That's the piece that we've got to make sure we have right. So if you get all those three areas, I think it's a much better way. And then make sure it's synchronized across public, private, and governmental sectors.
Great question.
Hello, thank you so much for being here. I had a question about, you mentioned how you would like the government to encourage more fluidity between the public and the private sector in terms of employment, and how that would sort of continue to bolster the United States' advantage in terms of talent and technological prowess. What are some strategies that you would suggest to implement that and to incentivize, especially young people like many of us here, to pursue careers both in the public sector and perhaps later on in the private sector and back again?
So a couple thoughts on that. One is, I think you have to meet more of the public sector folks that do this work, right? And one of the areas, not only that I really like professional management a lot, but, I come to places like Brown and Harvard and other places to encourage people for national service, right? Hey, there's a great opportunity out there. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the military. It can be the Peace Corps. It can be other things. But I think that that's mission one. The second thing is that, let's be honest. I think that there has to be a competitive salary. And sometimes that competitive salary might be, the forgiveness of student loans. It might be greater scholarships. The scholarship for service area that we've done in cyberspace has been tremendously helpful for us. And then the third way is, you may find this hard to believe, but there is a pretty big bureaucracy with the U.S. government, okay? And so when you join the government, they're not thinking about you leaving and coming back. Why is that? It's just because that's not what we did in the past. Well, why not? Why can't we think about that? Why can't we keep touch of folks? And that's just, I think, an area that we have to focus much harder on, particularly if there's involves a security clearance. Oh my goodness. Why are you leaving? Well, they're going out to work in the private sector and they'll be back in 5 years. Oh, they're gone. Well, how about if they come back? It's pretty tough right now to do that, and it shouldn't be. Yes?
Yeah, this might be a dumb question, but you just said that when someone says they're going to interfere with our elections, we're going to stop them. Do people actually say they're going to interfere in other countries' elections, and like in your experience? And because wouldn't that defeat the purpose, sort of?
Yeah, a couple thoughts. Yeah, so there are dumb people in the world still. And they do say that, and we take note of when they say that. But more importantly, we have a really good feel for the actors that do this type of work. It was interesting, my Cyber National Mission Force commander used to tell me, hey, sir, the same guys that are interfering in elections are the same guys that are working in Russia, Ukraine right now. So we know the actors, right? We know the folks that are doing. And so, to your point, let's not wait. Let's have a campaign, and this is what we've done pretty effectively. We're going to campaign against them, to cause friction, as you said. And causing this friction prevents them from becoming a problem in November. And that's the idea. And so while, a lot of times they won't say it, we definitely know who the folks are. And, their actions also say a lot to us as well.
Thank you for being here today. You've spoken a lot about how the NSA creates code and shares intelligence, but is that also a two-way street? Are the U.S. capabilities expanded by some of the technologies developed by our allies, especially allied governments?
Oh, yeah, for sure. For sure. I mean, this is someone once said, hey, what's the greatest secret that's not really known, that should be known by most folks? I would tell you one of the greatest secrets is the fact that after World War II, the United States and its English-speaking partners created a group called the Five Eyes. The U.S., Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the UK. And virtually, particularly within the signals intelligence, we share almost everything. Now think about that. That means we're in all time zones of the world. That means we're connected with people that are seeing different things. And so, if you have an ability to say, hey, why don't you focus on hardware? We're going to focus on software. Why don't you focus on this part of the world? We're going to focus on this part of the world. Suddenly it becomes much easier than having to do it all. And I think that that's a great lesson learned. And to your point, so I just briefly touched on it, but fall of 2021, when we released our most sensitive intelligence about what the Russians were going to do in Ukraine, it did three things. First of all, it built a coalition. So suddenly you're sharing this information with all of NATO, and then even our partners in the Pacific. And they say, they're not going to attack. Yeah, hey, take a look at this. This is what they're going to do. And then when you're right, amazing. I'd share a story with you. Susan and I were invited to the White House with all the other combatant commanders. And I'm getting off on a tangent here, but it's a pretty funny story. I looked at my card and it said number 3, table number 3. Oh, fantastic. I can just kind of kick back, and just, have dinner with my wife and, smile and everything like that. Who knew that the president would sit at table number 3? And sit next to Paul Nakasone. And so then, throughout the dinner, the one thing the president said to me, he said, hey, Paul, do you know how powerful it is when we share information and intelligence with our partners and it's right? Do you know how that makes them feel? So you're exactly correct. When we shared that information, it built a coalition. It disrupted an adversary in Russia, and then it enabled a partner in Ukraine. And that's what sharing does. And having more partners than less, I think, is really powerful.
If we have time for one more. This young man right here.
I don't have a microphone, but I can speak up. Hello. How is the United States preparing for a war with an adversary, or a direct war with an adversary with a lot of cyber capabilities? I'm specifically thinking about, a war with China over Taiwan, and at the prelude of that war, they would attack cyberspace and, try to disrupt American infrastructure.
So one of the things that, and I'm not sure if you received the article I'd written a couple years ago, I talk about in cyberspace, one of the things that I think is really important is really good militaries plan for the next war, they don't fight the last war. And so today, what I'm thinking about drones. I'm thinking about the fact that the Ukrainian Navy has sunk, multiple Russian battleships. Now, I never heard of the Ukrainian Navy before 2022. I can't even name one admiral from the Ukrainian Navy. But suddenly they're able to do that. And then I look at, the Red Sea, and I see the Houthis launching UAVs against our ships and commercial shipping in that portion of the world. And I think, well, that's really good that we can shoot them down now. But I'm thinking about what if they can swarm those things? And what happens when AI comes in? AI comes in, Tao, and they're able to target not only 1 or 2 or 3, but they can bring in 100 into our warship. How are we going to deal with that? And so to your point, I'm very, very hopeful that, I'm not the only person thinking about that. Because I do think that, we have a tendency as militaries to, as I said, fight the last war, not plan for the next. And I think we have to do that. Great question.
Very good. Well, this has been a great conversation and great questions from the audience. Thank you very much. I'm going to give you the last word, General, if there's anything we didn't cover that I should have asked. Or.
Thank you. So in my bio, one of the last things it says, I'm very passionate about national service and building caring, confident, and competent leaders. Let me talk about the former, national service. For all of you, no matter what age group, I would highly recommend thinking about national service. Now, you're talking to someone that just spent 3 decades in the United States Army. It doesn't have to be in the military. Whether or not it's Teach for America, whether or not it's the Peace Corps, whether or not it's state and local, it's a tremendous benefit for you. It's interesting when I see people that, have served in the Peace Corps, just that feeling of camaraderie that they have, or talking to someone that's taught for America, oh my goodness, it's really powerful. And so you have great opportunities in this nation. And so, as someone that has just, transitioned to private citizen, one of the things that I really encourage is think about that. You have the great opportunity to learn at one of the great institutions of the United States, Brown University. Think about what you could do in terms of bringing that insight and that power of knowledge to other parts of our country. So thanks much.
Outstanding.